And my hope and how I'm trying to instrument AI in my life is as an educator's tool, because I cannot always meet every student where they are and put it in a language that is, at a tempo or style that is most accessible to them. And so I really think if we can use AI to meet people where they are and help them level up, that is the future I want to see for AI.
Hello, everyone. I am Emily DeJeu, host of Tepper Perspectives Video and an assistant teaching professor of business communication at the Tepper School of Business. So artificial intelligence can automate repetitive or time-consuming tasks or analyze large amounts of data or information for patterns and anomalies. Operations like these are meant to help workers and make them better at their jobs. Our guest today is Brandy Aven, Associate Professor of Organizational Theory, Strategy, and Entrepreneurship at the Tepper School of Business. We're going to discuss how some company leaders have spoken up about plans to have AI replace large numbers of entry-level jobs, white-collar jobs, and eliminate entire sectors of the workforce. Outside of the boardroom, this is both unpopular and economically unsound. So why do industry leaders want these changes? Brandy Aven, welcome.
Thank you, Emily.
So let's start here. When tech leaders say things like AI will take most jobs, what do you think is really going on there? Why would they make claims like that?
What we're often seeing when we position AI or any technology as taking over jobs, it creates this sort of curious profile where why would leaders come out and say this, where it might create maybe potential backlash or animosity of their workforce. Yeah. And so you have to ask yourself, why would they publicly make such, broad sweeping claims? And so how do companies and industries continue to be in dialogue with regulators, with government and their workforce in a way that's going to provide the most opportunities moving forward? I think there's definitely a focus on affecting policy and making it less surprising as they lay off more of their workforce and rethink it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that we're kind of future casting and trying to shape a future as much as we are commenting on a present.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there's a duality that we're dealing with in so much as there's the technology, which isn't inherently good or bad. It's amoral. Yeah. And we've seen that with all forms of technology, going back all the way to the wheel, right? Humans are inherently lazy and we like to invent things that make things easier for us. And so that's one conversation about the cost of that technology and thinking about it. But again, I think of it as amoral. But on the other side, it's who's employing it, who has the power to decide, who gets access to it, how is it trained, how do we support it and build companies and commerce and economic action from it. And that's a sort of different conversation, but of course they come at this, intersection now where we're thinking about what does that mean with this new technological disruption.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So kind of building on what you said, if we're thinking about CEOs are trying to really shape policy, that would mean they're kind of trying to shape the future that we're going to share together as a society. Some have suggested that today's CEOs are maybe a little like Gilded Age robber barons, like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller. What's the value, if any, of thinking about this moment through that kind of lens?
So I love this question because it's something I've been quite obsessed about for the past year, quite frankly. So interestingly, the Gilded Age, the term, comes from a satirical book by Mark Twain, which most people don't realize.
I didn't.
And it was actually, and what he was actually doing with his co-author, who I cannot remember his name, was sort of arguing against the greed and corruption. And note that it's called the Gilded Age and not the Golden Age. And so in that is that satirical pushback of it's got a shiny gloss, it's lacquered, but underneath it is something of a far less value. And what they were pointing to was at that time a lot of corruption and inequality that we were seeing. Interestingly enough, and I did go back and check this, the Gini coefficient, which is a sort of rudimentary measure that many economists use to look at the concentration of resources and power. We they're actually at a higher concentration of power than during the Gilded Age. So it's a useful point to look back upon and draw from because it has that parallel. And we're seeing this sort of consolidation of power in a very similar pattern. So in 1900, JP Morgan bought Carnegie Steel. And so we get US Steel, which was the first $1 trillion company. But we were seeing this sort of consolidation of resources and power into one company. We are seeing the same thing now in different ways. And, another parallel is, again, that internet.com bubble. Many of the incumbents that we have now came out of that technological disruption. And interestingly enough, we had that groundbreaking antitrust case against Google, sort of showing that there has been this sort of mass consolidation of power. And interestingly enough, with AI, oftentimes it takes an inordinate amount of resources to build out these new technologies, which I think is far more like the Gilded Age, where we're building out railroads and steel. It takes a lot of an early capital and workforce investment to get it off the ground.
Yeah. I'm going to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
So on a recent episode of the Plain English podcast, the host had a guest on, a historian. And, we're in a moment when we're sort of casting around for metaphors. Like AI is like fill in the blank. AI is like a personal computer. AI is like the dawn of the internet. And we're often trying to find metaphors that we are familiar with. This historian made a great case that the building out of AI and the impacts it's having and will have is similar to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And part of his point was the huge amount of resources, the government footing the bill, speculators making sure they'd reap all the rewards without any of the risk. I wonder if you see, building on this Gilded Age idea that you're building out, if you see any other parallels, if you would also think like there's something to explore there.
Parallels in so much as AI is like a railroad.
Or like the Transcontinental Railroad.
I mean, I definitely agree with the underlying assumptions that all of these, huge government investments, we saw the robber barons or, capitals of industry, take whatever term you prefer, as really putting pressure on the U.S. government for land rights, right? So we're seeing that as well as we debate who gets to own certain algorithms and if they're U.S. based or otherwise, and taxes, right, as well, in terms of, and as well as tariffs, right? Sort of more of a protectionist type ideology around our tech and our infrastructure, but expecting the government to be the heavy in a lot of that, or to, as you said, foot the bill.
Yeah. And it strikes me that, of course, then the idea that I don't bear the risk, but I reap the reward. I wonder if we're going to see something, or maybe we're beginning to see something similar with this attempt to build out at scale AI with widespread adoption and widespread use.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that is going to be a fallout of it, that government, I mean, going back to the internet, right? This was part of like early government and university work that became a profit center for so many organizations. What I do think is interesting and somewhat compelling that we also have to take into account is how terrified the incumbents are and what that means for them. And it's another way to think about this and why they might be taking a more reactionary or protectionist position. So anytime we see a technological upheaval, whether it's railroads, which seems, of a long ago age, or the internet or PCs, we see that the incumbents often miss it, right? IBM missed the PC revolution, and Microsoft missed the internet, right? Like we have so many of these analogies, and I think one of the reasons they're so scared is they're not sure who will survive, who will miss the boat, and who the new sort of capitals of industry will be in their stead, which makes it, I think, in some ways a really exciting time because it's a reshuffling of the deck.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
We were also at the time of the Gilded Age in a hot debate about the gold standard. And we're also in a hot debate about understanding fiat currency versus Bitcoin. Right? So a lot of these things are so parallel. Like I was just at the Fed, and this is something we're constantly talking about, is how to understand that. And it's, and interestingly enough, a lot of it also is predicated on who owns debt, where is your
Yeah.
wealth situated,
Yeah.
and that sort of led to farmers wanting more, to continue with the silver dollar, where a lot of the capitalists in New York and here in Pittsburgh wanted the gold-backed
Yeah.
U.S. currency.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Isn't that wild?
The wheel.
Yeah,
The
it's
time
like-
is a wheel metaphor
Yeah.
continues. So, Brandy, I want to pick up on something you kind of sort of hinted at a little bit earlier. The idea that when our CEOs and leaders sort of project out about AI, it's as much about posturing for policy making and trying to sort of imagine it and be involved in shaping a future. It seems like there is also a kind of inevitability, like they're gesturing to something that they would say, this is inevitable. This is just going to happen. And I'm just reporting the weather when I frame it this way. I wonder what you think about that, because the future is always a site of possibility and it's something unknown. But of course, we can also project where something is headed and try to act accordingly. I wonder if you could speak to this idea that ubiquitous AI use that will put many people out of work is an inevitability, or just a projection, just a take that isn't rooted in some kind of certainty.
I will say, it really resonates with me that I do think AI is here. And as a technology, it's sort of unique in that it is going to be even harder to opt out of, where most technology is an opt-in. And we know it's very hard to sort of opt out of, the internet, right? PC usage. But at some point, like our parents, our grandparents were like, this is not for me. And we're able to do that. You can't do that with AI. It is baked into everything and it is already here. I think what is a little bit more of a bigger question is, will it take away jobs? Now, historically, technological disruptions, again, first, second industrial revolution, we saw manufacturing factories replace a lot of the artisanal work, right? A lot of agricultural jobs were moved, and it created, the sort of modern urban middle class, right? But it did displace a lot of labor. And so I think there's a greater conversation we could be having about what does this mean for our workforce? How do we create something that creates benefits for all? Because in general, we see when more people have access to a certain level of income, that the arts thrive. We see renaissance. We see innovation flourish. And that can be beneficial for all parties rather than a sort of a zero-sum positioning.
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate that. So, Brandy, one thing I think would be interesting to explore a little more, when a CEO says something like AI is going to take all jobs, one way we could react broadly as a society, we could have a sort of resigned trust and say, well, these individuals must know what they're talking about. This must be coming. I wonder, is that the best way to respond, or is there another way to approach it, which would be to look for real viable alternatives to these kinds of future casting predictions?
So it's a lovely point. And what I will say is I think it demands something even greater for looking for alternatives. And this may not be surprising coming from a Carnegie Mellon faculty. I think we have to build them, and we have to create spaces that afford for a diverse ecosystem of different technology. Some of the most interesting things that came out of the PC and .com era were generated by the open source movement. And what the open source movement often gives us is a proliferation and mushrooming of different solutions. And at the same time, what it does is it creates this concept that we use in organizational theory about learning, an absorptive capacity. So working with AI, trying out different technologies, it affords like us better workforce that know these hacks and ways to think about the technology in more innovative or compelling ways. And so I think we have to work as a society to make sure we keep expanding who gets to build and work in this space. And so sometimes with something that requires such heavy infrastructure, it might have to be centered in universities where we have seen be the font of many innovations that we're all now benefiting from. Or it could be, just like the iconic garage story of many startups in Silicon Valley. It could be some kids working with AI. It is getting cheaper. It is getting more efficient. And so making sure that as many people who want to participate in the space have access to it, I think that's what we need to be thinking about moving forward.
And how we might get to more myriad, diverse representations of what futures could look like.
Exactly, right? Because, if, sometimes it seems like when we talk about diversity, it can be used in lots of different ways, but you have to understand how to solve for a market. And what's the best way to solve for a market problem is to have a representative from that market. And so as we think about these technologies being baked in so many ways, we need to understand the use cases in as many ways possible, even if they're edge cases, for an array of reasons. It's probably going to be a generator of innovation and creativity, but then it also means we're solving a lot of problems that we may not have fully anticipated. Like one of my favorite facts is that more able-bodied people benefit from the American Disabilities Act than people who identify as having a disability, because if you've used a stroller or rode a bike on a sidewalk, you understand what cutouts on curbs do, right? If you've broken a leg and had to use an elevator, you understand the merit of that edge case, but only in that circumstance. And so having as many different representations there is going to be key for building out. There is even a growing movement called Indigenous AI, where people are looking at using sort of the knowledge base of Indigenous people and understanding how to incorporate that in really profound ways that some people might find a little challenging. But for example, if we treat Series and the AIs as secondary, as sort of enslaved objects, are we creating a language and, encoding them in such a way that might be problematic? Now, I'm not saying, AI is fully sentient and, coming for us, but we have to think about how we dialogue with it and what we're training it on, because as we dialogue it and how we interface with it will create certain expectations of how we are going to behave as humans.
And I like what you're sharing, because I think if we go back to this idea of the Gilded Age, and we're sort of maybe duplicating that in some ways today, a way to counter that, if we think about the Gilded Age where immense power is held in the hands of very few, what you're advocating for, it sounds like, or pointing out at least, is that the way we get different representations of what the future with AI could look like is to invite more players to the table, to distribute power and participation across many hands, as opposed to keeping it concentrated in the hands of titans of industry.
Absolutely. And that's just an economic fact, right? The more we see different companies having a robust competition leads to the consumers having a better outcome. That's why we have antitrust laws. When you have a captured market, you have no incentive to innovate. You have no incentive to respond to that market, right, as a monopoly. But the more they have to compete with each other just means we're going to see a flourishing of hopefully beneficial AI that hopefully will progress us as a species and society.
That's great. So, Brandy, as we wrap up here, I want to zoom out and think big picture. There's a vision of the future that we could call doom scenario, right? AI is everywhere. It has drastically changed employment. It's made us feel isolated and alone, and it's full of misinformation, and it's just warped and shredded society. That's one scenario. How would you maybe speak into that? If we have viewers or listeners who maybe are inclined that way when they think about this disruptive new technology, how could you address maybe the doom scenario, folks?
So I think we need to move away from this sort of what I would say like false binary of this doomsday apocalypse. One is this rhetoric has also been used, just as we were talking about the CEOs, by the workforce. I mean, even going back to the Luddites, right? Of new technology creating this dystopic future for us all. And rather than staying in that sort of, doom, with AI, or we, escape unsheathed without AI, is to have the more nuanced conversation about how do we move forward, given everything we know about technological disruptions, in the most thoughtful way, right? And it's not going to be an easy conversation, in so much as, creating policies that still allow AI companies and to flourish, and setting up incentives that don't undermine their willingness to build companies here that really gain traction is one part of the conversation. But there's the other of how do we make sure that it's not consolidated in a few incumbent companies' hands who may not be even at the helm of innovation. You may have seen that MIT report that I thought was really interesting about how even with the widespread adoption of AI, many companies are not seeing any sort of monetary benefits, which, my training is as an economic sociologist is not surprising to us because oftentimes what we see with new technology is what we call ceremonial adoption. And so we're in that phase. And so what does that mean? So to harken back, with the advent of PCs, we saw a lot of companies using PCs as just like digital file cabinets, right? They weren't actually using them in the full way that we use them now. My parents and, many people when the internet came online used it as a phone book, right? And didn't fully understand all the novelties and benefits of it until it was a fully realized industry. And I think that's kind of where we're at. And so I think, but creating a space to make sure all of that gets developed in its fullness is going to be really critical moving forward. And there's some things we can do. We talked about making sure, we have a space for, whatever variant of open source will come to bear on AI, whatever that looks like, because it's probably going to look different than what I grew up with. I think there's a lot in terms of transparency and explaining models and creating that visibility, so if your credit score is based on AI, why it's coming up with those certain metrics for you. We need to have vision into that, and that can have negative consequences. And then I think as we move forward, we need to be thinking about an entrepreneurial mindset. It's something we've always talked about our workforce, but we've seen so many big technological jumps and black swan disruptions in the past decade, let alone last 30 years, that, I think thinking as, a worker, as a job that you will have for the entirety of your life has gone completely away. And so, we need to think about as a society, how do we create a platform to allow for that kind of entrepreneurial endeavor, for this, new company to come up, or just a workforce that thinks independently and can stay ahead of innovations and be far less passive in how they engage with corporations. And that also means that, they could walk at any time as an entrepreneurial workforce, right? That they could start something in their garage and have, the support of the Small Business Administration behind them with loans and whatnot.
So last question, let's imagine we addressed the doom scenario, folks. Given all your expertise and everything you've studied and kind of your academic background, if you had to paint the rosiest possible picture of the AI in the future, where it is nothing but net benefit, what would that look like to you? What would the dream scenario for the future of AI, in Brandy's perspective, look like?
Oh, okay. This question I might go a little off the rails here. So one I would say is, and this is a shout out to my favorite historian, Jill Lepore, who's at Harvard, and she has a great piece with the BBC on looking at science fiction and how many of our CEOs in tech, how they dialogue with it, and especially Elon Musk talking about, and Heinlein and Asimov, which I grew up reading the Foundation series and love all those books. But it was really transformational for me to start to read Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin, right? And so I draw a lot of my ideas from science fiction. And the one I will really point to, which is my unique, or my sense of what would be utopic, comes from a Neil Stephenson book called The Diamond Age. And it's this really lovely story that even kind of harkens back to the Victorian era, where you had the Victorians who were an elite group, right? And we often see this in sort of dystopic fiction where you have a bifurcated, even going to H.G. Wells, right? Like those who live above ground and those who live below. And so they had the Victorians, and then they had everybody else who lived in sort of really far less than ideal circumstances. And this incredible engineer who is working with AI is commissioned to build, and again, this is before an iPad, before AI, basically an iPad with AI for the soon-to-be queen, right? The rising leader, to help her develop. So it's this unique educational tool that's meant to kind of grow with her. So he feels that it shouldn't just go into one person's hands, so he builds two. And it falls into the hands of a young girl in the story who becomes the protagonist, who is going through abuse in her home, has food uncertainty. And the iPad, rather than starting with, understanding, differentials in calculus realize it has to meet her where she is. And it teaches her how to throw a punch. It teaches her how to like find food, right? And then she ends up becoming this like exemplar human because it met her where she was. And my hope and how I, I'm trying to instrument AI in my life is as an educator's tool, because I cannot always meet every student where they are and put it in a language that is, at a tempo or style that is most accessible to them. And so I really think if we can use AI to meet people where they are and help them level up, that is the future I want to see for AI.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Brandy Aven. And thank you for watching. To those of you who watched, please visit tepperspectives.cmu.edu for more videos, articles, and the Tep Perspectives podcast.